The midday sun beat down on the sprawling construction site, a symphony of clanging metal, whirring saws, and the guttural rumble of excavators. Dust motes danced in the golden shafts of light, coating everything in a fine, gritty film. Sweat trickled down Marco's temples, stinging his eyes, but he barely noticed. His focus was locked on the rebar he was meticulously tying, the rhythmic click-clack of his pliers a familiar lullaby against the industrial cacophony. He was a sculptor of concrete and steel, a builder shaping the future skyline of this burgeoning city. He loved this work. The sheer physicality of it, the tangible progress made with every beam hoisted, every wall erected. It was honest labor, demanding and unforgiving, but deeply satisfying. His biceps burned, his back ached, but there was a primal pride in the calluses that roughened his hands, the muscle that hardened his frame. He felt alive, connected to something real and enduring. His crew, a tight-knit unit of seasoned workers, moved with practiced efficiency. Big Joe, a mountain of a man with a booming laugh, was wrestling a steel girder into place. Maria, her movements surprisingly delicate for the heavy equipment she operated, guided the excavator with pinpoint precision. Even young Leo, still finding his footing, was diligently hauling bricks, his earnest face flushed with effort. They were a well-oiled machine, each cog performing its vital function. Suddenly, a shrill, high-pitched yelp pierced through the din. It was a sound so out of place, so incongruous with the industrial roar, that it made Marco's head snap up. It was followed by a frantic, tinny barking, a sound that spoke of pure, unadulterated panic. Marco squinted, scanning the perimeter of the site. The construction zone was securely fenced, a barrier against the curious and the careless. He saw a flash of white fluff near the temporary hoarding, a frantic blur of motion. Then, a voice, sharp and imperious, cut through the air like a shard of glass. "Stop! Stop everything! You are terrifying my Fifi!" Marco frowned. Fifi? What in the... He'd heard all sorts of complaints in his years on construction sites. Noise complaints, dust complaints, complaints about the smell of freshly poured concrete, but never a complaint about a dog being scared. He straightened up, wiping his brow with the back of his gloved hand. The barking intensified, a frantic staccato that seemed to echo Marco's bewilderment. He saw the source of the commotion now. A woman, dressed in what appeared to be a pristine white linen pantsuit, stood just outside the fence, her face contorted in a mask of indignation. Clutched in her perfectly manicured hand was a leash, and at the end of that leash, a tiny, trembling ball of white fur. The poodle. It was, indeed, a poodle, its fur impeccably groomed, its tiny body quivering like a leaf in a storm. The woman, evidently the owner of the terrified canine, was pointing a trembling finger directly at Marco. He was the closest one to the fence, operating the rebar tying machine. The machine, a powerful, albeit noisy piece of equipment, emitted a series of sharp, repetitive clicks as it twisted the steel wires. He'd been using it for the last hour, and it had never caused any issues before. "You!" she shrieked, her voice rising in pitch. "You with the noisy contraption! You're frightening my Fifi! Stop it immediately!" Marco blinked. He was... What? He was working. He was doing his job. He looked at his foreman, a burly man named Sal who had seen it all, his expression a mixture of amusement and exasperation. Sal just shook his head and mouthed, "You've got to be kidding me." "Ma'am," Marco began, his voice calm, trying to de-escalate the absurdity. "I'm on a construction site. This is a noisy environment. We're working." "I don't care what you're doing," she retorted, her eyes narrowing. "My Fifi is a very sensitive creature. She has never been subjected to such cacophony. You are causing her immense distress. You must stop this minute." The poodle, as if on cue, let out another pathetic whimper, burying its face in the woman's expensive-looking handbag. Marco felt a wave of disbelief wash over him, quickly followed by a surge of annoyance. He was a skilled tradesman, a vital part of a complex project. He wasn't some hooligan making a racket for fun. This woman, with her designer clothes and her pampered pet, had no idea what she was talking about. "Ma'am," Marco said, his tone hardening slightly. "This is a construction site. We have permits. We have deadlines. We can't just stop working because a dog is scared." "Permits? Deadlines?" she scoffed, a dramatic flair to her words. "Are you implying that your industrial endeavors are more important than the emotional well-being of an innocent animal?" She clutched the poodle tighter, as if shielding it from an impending attack. Marco's jaw tightened. He saw his teammates exchange glances, a silent acknowledgement of the bizarre situation. Big Joe let out a low chuckle, which was quickly stifled by a glare from Sal. "It's not about importance, ma'am," Marco explained, trying to keep his temper in check. "It's about necessity. We're building something here. This machine is essential for that." "Essential?" she repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "More essential than Fifi's delicate nerves? I don't think so. I demand that you cease this infernal noise at once. If you do not, I will be forced to take further action. I have friends in high places." Marco just stared at her. Friends in high places. It was the classic Karen playbook. He'd heard stories, of course. Everyone on a construction site had heard stories, but he'd never actually experienced it firsthand. Until now. He looked at the poodle, its eyes wide and pleading. He looked back at the woman, her face a picture of self-righteous fury. He felt a phantom itch on his skin, the feeling of being unfairly judged, of being misunderstood by someone who clearly had no grasp of his reality. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and measured, "I'm not going to stop working. This is my job, and I'm not going to apologize for doing my job." The woman's face paled, then flushed a deep crimson. You insolent man," she sputtered. "You will regret this. I will report you. I will report this entire eyesore." She turned on her heel, the poodle still trembling in her arms, and stormed away, her voice a furious stream of indignant pronouncements about animal cruelty and negligent construction practices. Marco watched her go, a strange mixture of frustration and a grim sort of amusement settling in his chest. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that this was not the end of it. The construction site, his sanctuary of honest labor, had just been invaded by a Karen and her poodle. The day, which had started with the promise of steady progress, had just taken a decidedly bizarre and potentially problematic turn. He returned to his rebar, the clicking of his pliers now feeling a little less like a lullaby and a little more like a defiant declaration. My biceps were still burning, the familiar ache a testament to a job well done. The rhythmic click-clack of the rebar tying machine had been a kind of lullaby against the industrial cacophony of the site, the guttural rumble of the excavator, the whirring of saws, the clang of metal on metal. It was the soundtrack to progress, to building something real that would stand long after I was gone. Then she had arrived, a pristine white linen anomaly against the dust and grit, with her trembling, tinny-voiced poodle. Fifi, she'd called the quivering furball. Fifi was apparently traumatized by the sound of honest work. I watched her retreat, her immaculate white pantsuit a stark contrast to the mud-splattered hoarding that marked the perimeter of our world. She'd stomped off, muttering about negligent construction practices and animal cruelty, as if I were personally torturing her pampered pet with a sonic weapon. I just shrugged, my calloused hand still gripping the tool, the familiar weight a comfort. Sal, my foreman, had just shaken his head, a slow, deliberate movement that spoke volumes. He'd mouthed something that looked suspiciously like, You've got to be kidding me." Big Joe, usually the joker of the crew, had just leaned on his shovel, a silent chuckle rumbling in his chest. Maria, always the pragmatist, had simply adjusted her hard hat and gone back to sorting rebar. The incident, as bizarre as it was, had been just that, an incident, a momentary absurd interruption. We'd gone back to work, the rhythm re-established, the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. I'd tied another 100 bundles of rebar, each one a small victory, a building block for the skyscraper that was slowly, surely, clawing its way into the sky. The concrete trucks arrived, their massive drums churning, and the air filled with the rich, earthy smell of wet cement. We worked through the lunch break, the sandwiches tasting even better when you'd earned them with sweat. But a seed of unease had been planted. It wasn't just the sheer ridiculousness of it all. It was the sheer entitlement. This woman, who clearly knew nothing about what we did, about the permits, the inspections, the sheer brute force and precision that went into this project, had felt empowered to halt our progress, because her dog was, in her estimation, having a bad day. It was like a mosquito bite, annoying, insignificant in the grand scheme, but persistent. And then, an hour later, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a different kind of vehicle pulled up. Not a beat-up pickup truck belonging to one of the subs, or a sleek sedan of some visiting architect. This was a gleaming black SUV, the kind that whispered wealth and importance. It parked, not on the street, but right in front of the main gate, blocking the access for our smaller utility vehicles. The tinted windows were impenetrable, but I had a sinking feeling I knew who was inside. Sal, ever vigilant, ambled over. He'd seen it all in his 30 years on the job. He'd dealt with cranky neighbors, city inspectors who were too eager to find fault, even the occasional celebrity who wanted a peek at the latest shiny new building. But this felt different. The SUV sat there, a silent, imposing presence, radiating an aura of self-importance that was almost palpable. The driver's side window glided down, revealing a man in a sharp suit, his face impassive. He didn't get out. He just looked at Sal, then gestured with a perfectly manicured hand towards the construction site, a subtle, almost imperceptible flick of his wrist. "Can I help you?" Sal asked, his voice calm, but with that slight edge that told you he wasn't messing around. The man in the suit cleared his throat. "My client, Mrs. Albright, has lodged a formal complaint regarding the noise and disturbance emanating from this facility. She believes it is negatively impacting the well-being of her pet, Fifi." Sal's eyebrows shot up. "Fifi? The poodle?" The man nodded, his expression unchanging. "Precisely. Mrs. Albright feels the cacophony, as she described it, is causing her pet significant distress. She has requested that you cease all noisy operations immediately, or at least until a more suitable time, and that steps be taken to mitigate the sound." I swear I heard a collective groan ripple through the crew. We were tying rebar, sure, but the excavator was still rumbling, the occasional hammer blow echoed, and the general hum of a working site was constant. This was a construction site, not a library. "Cease operations?" Sal repeated, a disbelieving laugh escaping him. "Buddy, we've got a schedule. We've got deadlines. We're building a building here, not throwing a tea party." "My client is aware of that," the man in the suit replied smoothly. "However, her concerns are not to be dismissed. She has retained legal counsel and is prepared to pursue all avenues to ensure her pet's comfort and her property's quiet enjoyment." Legal counsel? For a poodle's nerves? I straightened up, wiping a bead of sweat from my forehead with the back of my glove. This was escalating. This wasn't just some entitled lady with a dog. This was a full-blown, capital K Karen situation, now with legal backing. "Look, pal," Sal said, stepping closer to the tinted window, his voice a low rumble. "We've got all the permits. We're up to code. We're doing our jobs. This is what a construction site sounds like. It's not exactly a spa retreat for pampered pets." The man in the suit offered a thin, humorless smile. "Mrs. Albright's property is adjacent to this site. The noise levels, particularly from that device you were operating earlier, are unacceptable. She believes it constitutes a nuisance." My rebar tying machine. The innocent, efficient tool that had apparently committed a sonic atrocity. I felt a surge of indignation mixed with a morbid fascination. This was beyond anything I'd ever encountered. "A nuisance?" I called out, my voice rough from the dust. "We're building a 20-story office building. It's going to bring jobs, revenue. It's progress." The man in the suit turned his gaze towards me, his eyes cool and appraising, like he was looking at a particularly stubborn piece of lumber. "Progress, sir, should not come at the expense of the well-being of innocent creatures, nor the peace of mind of law-abiding citizens. The sheer gall. Innocent creatures, law-abiding citizens. He made it sound like we were a bunch of hooligans trashing the neighborhood." Sal held up a hand, silencing me. He looked back at the man in the suit. "Tell your client we're following all regulations. If she's got issues, she can take it up with the city council, not with us. We're not stopping work for a dog." The man's lips thinned. "Very well. Mrs. Albright has instructed me to inform you that if the situation is not rectified by morning, she will be seeking an injunction." He paused, letting the word hang in the air like a threat. "And she will, of course, be filing a detailed report with animal control regarding the perceived cruelty." An injunction? Animal control? I exchanged a bewildered look with Big Joe. This was seriously entering the realm of the absurd. We were talking about a dog that probably had its own personal groomer. The man in the suit gave a curt nod, and the window slid back up, sealing him and his client's complaints inside their fortress of tinted glass. The SUV then smoothly, silently pulled away, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive exhaust fumes and the palpable sense of impending hassle. Sal let out a long, slow breath. He ran a hand over his grizzled chin. Well, I'll be damned. She wasn't kidding. He turned to the crew, his eyes twinkling with a mix of annoyance and dark amusement. "All right, people, you heard the man. Looks like we've got a poodle problem. Keep the noise down as much as possible, though I don't know how we're supposed to build a skyscraper with whispers and polite requests." He clapped his hands together. "All right, let's power through. We've got a building to finish, and if anyone sees that white suit and that yappy little dog again, just ignore them. They're not worth the aggravation." But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my gut, that it wasn't going to be that simple. The woman, Mrs. Albright, had taken her complaint to a whole new level. She hadn't just been an angry neighbor. She'd become a force of nature, a storm cloud of entitlement armed with legal threats and a supposed concern for animal welfare. And we, the humble builders of concrete and steel, were caught in her path. The primal pride I felt in my work, in the tangible results of my labor, was now being challenged by the intangible, irrational world of a pampered poodle and its equally pampered owner. The construction site, my sanctuary of honest work, had officially been invaded. And I had a feeling this was far from over. The next morning was going to be interesting. The man in the suit, Mr. Sterling, had a voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement, brittle and unpleasant. He delivered his pronouncement with a practiced air of grave importance, as if he were announcing the downfall of empires, not a noise complaint from a woman with a yappy dog. Sal, my foreman, had just stood there, his face a mask of disbelief, slowly morphing into weary resignation. He'd finally just given a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Right then, Mr. Sterling," Sal had managed, his voice flat. "We'll keep that in mind." Mr. Sterling had given a curt nod, a tiny smirk playing on his lips, and then he'd vanished as quickly as he'd appeared, leaving behind a cloud of expensive cologne and a palpable tension that settled over us like the ever-present dust. The rhythmic click-clack of my rebar tying machine, which had been a familiar lullaby against the industrial cacophony, suddenly felt like a ticking time bomb. Every whir, every metallic snap, now echoed with the potential for a lawsuit, a fine, or worse, a shutdown. "You've got to be kidding me," Big Joe muttered, wiping sweat from his brow with a forearm thick as a tree branch. He'd been wrestling with a length of rebar that looked like a metallic spaghetti monster, his usual booming laughter replaced by a low grumble. Maria, usually the picture of stoic focus as she expertly maneuvered a concrete pump, paused, her eyes wide. "Animal control? For a dog? We're building a hospital, for crying out loud." Leo, the youngest of the crew, just looked pale. He was still getting used to the sheer scale of the project, the relentless pace, and the constant hum of danger that was inherent to the job. The idea of legal trouble, especially over something so absurd, was clearly unnerving him. I looked down at my hands, the calluses rough and familiar. My biceps, burning from the steady work, felt like they'd been put to the ultimate test, not by the weight of steel or the strain of concrete, but by the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of it all. This wasn't about negligent construction practices or safety violations. It was about a poodle, a fluffy, pampered poodle named Fifi. "So, what now, Sal?" I asked, my voice a little rougher than I intended. The rebar tying machine sat idle in my hand, its coiled wire a silent testament to the ridiculousness of our predicament. Sal sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of every complaint he'd ever fielded in his 30 years on the job. He ran a hand over his thinning hair, his gaze sweeping over the site. The excavators were still rumbling, the cranes were still lifting girders into place, the saws were still buzzing. Progress, steady and undeniable, was being made. But now, it was all underscored by this ridiculous threat. "Now," Sal said, his voice carefully neutral, "we work. We just work a little quieter, if that's even possible." He shot a pointed look towards the perimeter hoarding, as if Mrs. Albright might somehow be able to hear the subtle nuances of our decibel levels through solid steel. "And we keep our eyes peeled. Mr. Sterling said she's got lawyers. That means we gotta be buttoned up. No mistakes, not a single one." The directive hung in the air, a heavy blanket smothering the usual easy camaraderie. We were a well-oiled machine, a symphony of clanging metal and shouted instructions, all working towards a common goal. But now, a single irrational note had been struck, and the harmony was off. We went back to it, but the energy had shifted. The primal pride in the calluses that roughened my hands, the satisfaction of seeing steel and concrete take shape under our efforts, was now tinged with a gnawing unease. I tried to focus, to get back into the rhythm of tying rebar, but my mind kept drifting back to Mrs. Albright's pristine white linen pantsuit, her perfectly manicured hand gesturing imperiously, her voice, sharp and imperious, cutting through the air like a shard of glass. And Fifi, the poodle, quivering like a leaf in a storm. The rest of the day was a weird, subdued affair. We all tried to be more mindful of the noise. Instead of the usual robust calls and whistles, we resorted to hand signals and quieter conversations. The rebar tying machine, usually a steady companion, felt like it was whispering rather than working. It was like trying to perform surgery with a butter knife. We were still building, still making progress, but the spirit of it felt dampened. The sheer audacity of it all was almost breathtaking. All that work, all that effort, all that tangible creation being held hostage by the imagined distress of a dog. As the shift wound down, the usual banter about dinner plans and weekend tickets was replaced by hushed speculation. "Think she'll really do it?" Leo asked, his voice barely above a whisper as we stowed our tools. With lawyers involved? Sal said, shaking his head again. You never know. Some people got more money than sense, and when they get it in their heads that they're right, well... He trailed off, a familiar weariness settling over him. I packed up my gear, the weight of the coil of steel wire in my hand, feeling heavier than usual. I'd spent years on construction sites, from small residential builds to towering skyscrapers. I'd seen it all. Angry neighbors, city inspectors with their clipboards and their rules, even the occasional street performer trying to get a rise out of us. But this was a whole new level of bizarre. Walking out of the site gates, the familiar city noise seemed amplified. The distant wail of sirens, the roar of traffic, the general urban hum, it all felt like a soundtrack to our predicament. We were a small island of organized industry in a sea of everyday chaos, and some pampered poodle owner had decided our little island was a threat to her delicate sensibilities. The next morning, the atmosphere was thick with a nervous energy. Sal had briefed us again before we even started. All right, listen up. Mr. Sterling called. Mrs. Albright's lawyers sent a formal notice. They're threatening an injunction to halt all work if we don't, mitigate the sonic disturbance to Fifi. And they've also filed a complaint with Animal Control about cruel and unusual noise pollution affecting a vulnerable animal. I'm not even kidding. Animal Control. He looked at us, his eyes pleading for understanding. So, same as yesterday. Keep it down, be aware, and if any more of her kind show up, you don't talk to them. You send them to me, got it? A chorus of grunts and nods confirmed we'd heard him. The irony was not lost on any of us. We were the ones with the permits, the blueprints, the deadlines. We were the ones doing the actual, tangible work that would eventually house families, provide services, build a community. And we were being treated like the villains, all because of a dog's alleged distress. I picked up my rebar tying machine. The familiar weight in my hand, the satisfying heft of it, was usually a comfort. Today it felt like a weapon, albeit a very loud one. I took a deep breath, the gritty air filling my lungs, and tried to push the absurdity of it all to the back of my mind. We had a job to do, a hospital to build, and apparently, a poodle to placate. The morning wore on, a tense ballet of controlled noise. We worked with a heightened sense of awareness, each clink and clang seeming to echo with potential repercussions. I found myself watching the perimeter hoarding more than usual, half expecting Mrs. Albright and Fifi to reappear, perhaps with a sound meter this time, or maybe a tiny, dog-sized, noise-canceling headset. Then, around mid-morning, it happened. A flash of pristine white caught my eye, a stark contrast to the muted browns and grays of the construction site. Mrs. Albright. And by her side, a man in a smart, dark suit, his expression as unreadable as Mr. Sterling's. He held a clipboard, and he was talking to Sal, his voice low, but distinct enough to carry in the momentary lull between machine cycles. Sal's shoulders were tight. He was nodding, listening intently, but his body language screamed frustration. I saw him gesture towards the site, towards the steel skeletons of buildings rising against the sky, as if to say, "This is what we do. This is necessary." Mrs. Albright, however, was not looking at the buildings. She was looking at my rebar tying machine, her face a mask of indignation. Fifi, nestled in her arms, let out a tiny, tinny yelp. It was the sound of a creature whose entire existence revolved around being pampered, a sound that probably got its own special grooming appointment. The man in the suit finished speaking to Sal and then turned, his gaze sweeping over the crew. It lingered on me for a moment. I felt a prickle of unease, a sense of being judged by someone who had no idea what we actually did here, day in and day out. He then turned back to Mrs. Albright, and I heard a few more clipped words. And then they were gone, disappearing as quickly as they had arrived. Sal walked back towards me, his face a study in controlled fury. He didn't need to say anything. The tight set of his jaw, the way he rubbed the back of his neck, spoke volumes. "What was that all about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. Sal let out a breath. "More of the same. They're here to observe. Apparently, Fifi is still experiencing significant distress from the general ambiance of progress." He paused, then added with a grim chuckle. "And the guy's a lawyer. Says he's here to ensure minimal impact on the local fauna." Fauna. He called us fauna. The word hung in the air, ludicrous and insulting. Fauna. We were the ones building the future, creating something tangible and important, and we were being reduced to a collection of noisy creatures that needed to be managed for the comfort of a pampered poodle. "So, what's the plan?" Leo asked, his voice laced with worry. Sal looked around at all of us, his eyes meeting mine. There was a glint there, a spark of defiance that had been missing earlier. "The plan," he said, his voice gaining a little of its usual strength, "is we keep working. We do our jobs, we build this damn hospital. And if Mrs. Albright and her lawyer want to stand out there and listen to us build, that's their business. But they're not stopping us. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. We have permits. We have deadlines. And we've got a job to do." He clapped his hands together, a sharp, decisive sound that cut through the tension. "All right, people. Let's get back to it. And for the love of God, try not to scare any more small, fluffy animals. We've got a reputation to maintain." A ripple of something akin to relief, mixed with a healthy dose of grim determination, went through the crew. We picked up our tools, the rhythmic click-clack of my rebar tying machine starting up again. It was still loud, still industrial, still the sound of progress. But now, it felt like the sound of defiance. We were going to build this hospital, with or without the approval of a high-strung poodle and her entitled owner. This was our site, our work, and no amount of legal threats or absurd complaints was going to change that. The battle had begun, and it was being fought not with jackhammers and concrete, but with sheer, stubborn resolve. The familiar rhythmic click-clack of the rebar tying machine, which had been the soundtrack to our lives for weeks, now felt like a defiant drumbeat against the absurdity. Sal's words, a gruff reassurance that we had our permits and our deadlines, echoed in my head. We were builders, not entertainers, and certainly not dog whisperers. But even as we picked up our tools, a nervous energy hummed through the crew. We all knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Mrs. Albright, or whatever her name was, had a lawyer. Lawyers meant trouble, the kind that could tie up a project for months with paperwork and injunctions, all because her pampered poodle couldn't handle the symphony of progress. I went back to my section, the steel wires of the rebar tying machine cool and familiar in my gloved hands. The metal rod felt solid, real. This was tangible. This mattered. I wasn't just making noise. I was laying the foundation for something that would stand for decades, something that would house families, provide jobs, and contribute to the city's pulse. A dog's whim, no matter how loudly amplified by a lawyer, felt like a mosquito buzzing around a skyscraper. Annoying, yes, but ultimately insignificant in the grand scheme. Big Joe, a mountain of a man with forearms like oak branches, grunted as he wrestled a particularly stubborn section of rebar into place. "You hear that, Marco?" he mumbled, his voice a low rumble. "Animal control. For noise. What's next? The pigeons are gonna sue us for disturbing their roosts." Maria, her movements precise and efficient as she worked a few feet away, chuckled. Maybe we should offer Fifi a noise-canceling headset or a tiny, custom-built soundproof doghouse. We tried to keep the noise down, of course. Sal had made that clear. No unnecessary shouting. No revving of engines when not in use. just the hum of necessary work. It felt like trying to tiptoe through a hurricane, but we did our best. The whirring of the saws still cut through the air. The guttural rumble of the excavator preparing a new trench was unavoidable, and the clang of metal on metal was as inherent to this job as sweat and dust. I focused on the task at hand, the satisfying whir-snap of the rebar tying machine as it bound two steel rods together. Each connection was a small victory, a step closer to completion. I could feel the familiar burn in my biceps, the gritty film of dust settling on my skin, the sweat stinging my eyes. This was honest work, the kind that left you bone-tired but with a primal pride in the calluses that roughened your hands and the tangible results of your labor. An hour later, the rhythmic pulse of our work was shattered, not by a new complaint, but by a different kind of interruption. A sleek, black sedan, the kind that whispered wealth rather than shouted it, pulled up to the hoarding, its tires barely making a sound on the asphalt. The passenger door opened, and out stepped a man in a sharp, charcoal gray suit. He had the kind of polished, unruffled demeanor that screamed, "Lawyer." He surveyed the site, his gaze sweeping over our dusty figures and the towering steel skeletons, with an expression that was less curious and more analytical. He was clearly not here to admire our craftsmanship. He walked with a purposeful stride to the site office, where Sal was poring over blueprints. We watched, a collective quiet falling over the crew as he disappeared inside. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the distant, tinny barking that we now recognized as Fifi's. It was a sound that had become a symbol of our current predicament. A few minutes later, Sal emerged, his face a mask of weary resignation. He held a sheaf of papers, the kind with official-looking letterheads. He walked over to where I was working, the rest of the crew subtly pausing their tasks to observe. "All right, folks," Sal said, his voice low but carrying. "Looks like Mrs. Albright's lawyer, Mr. Sterling, is back, and he's brought gifts." He gestured to the papers. "They're not messing around. This is a formal cease and desist order. They're claiming our operations are a nuisance and detrimental to the well-being of the animal kingdom, specifically one Fifi Albright." A ripple of disbelief went through the crew. Maria let out a disbelieving laugh. "The animal kingdom? We're building a building, not conducting experiments on lab rats." "And Fifi's well-being," Leo, a young apprentice who usually chatted non-stop, said with a shake of his head. "That dog probably sleeps on silk pillows and eats caviar. I doubt a little construction noise is going to send her to the vet." Sal held up a hand. I know. It's insane. But Sterling's made it clear. If we don't significantly reduce the noise, they're filing for an injunction with the courts, and he's also filed a formal complaint with the city's Department of Environmental Protection. Apparently, they have a special division for canine acoustics. The phrase canine acoustics hung in the air, absurd and alien. It was like something out of a bad satire. We looked at each other, a mixture of incredulity and growing frustration on our faces. This wasn't just a grumpy neighbor anymore. This was a full-blown legal assault, orchestrated by a woman who seemed to believe her poodle's delicate sensibilities were more important than the livelihoods of dozens of workers and the progress of a major city project. "So, what do we do, Sal?" I asked, my voice tight. The primal pride I'd felt earlier was starting to curdle into a hard knot of annoyance. Sal sighed, running a hand over his grizzled hair. "We do what we've been doing. We work. But we work smarter, quieter. We minimize anything that's not absolutely essential. No non-essential banging, no unnecessary revving. We use hand tools where possible, even if it slows us down. We document everything. Every permit, every inspection, every minute we're on site." He looked directly at me, then at Big Joe and Maria. "And we don't let this situation break us. We've got deadlines. We've got families to feed. We're not going to be bullied off our own job by a barking dog and a lawyer with too much time on his hands." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crew. "Sterling wants us to soundproof the entire perimeter of the site. That's not happening. Not overnight, anyway. And it's ridiculous. Our permits are in order. We're operating within all noise ordinances for a construction zone. But they're going to drag this out."